Serverless is a buzzword, perhaps more meaningless now, even in cloud, right? There's a lot of debates over what serverless means. There's a lot of, nobody can really agree, and it gets applied to all sorts of things that it probably shouldn't. But what I want to convince you of today is that at heart, serverless is not about technology, but about an approach to choosing technology. I want to convince you that you can take that mindset and apply it to any situation. It doesn't matter if you're able to choose the technologies that we call serverless, and that doing so is going to help you deliver more value to your customers. This shift requires recontextualizing the role of developers in the development process, in the product delivery process. And I don't just mean developers, I mean anyone who's involved in that product delivery process. QA, operations, security, etc. And so if you're here today because you love Lambda or you love other functions as a service products, you're here for the wrong reason. Because functions are not the point of serverless. Like, don't get me wrong, functions are great, right? They allow you to deliver code while not managing the runtime and the OS underlying them. They fit naturally with event-driven architectures. They scale transparently. These are all fantastic, useful properties. But functions end up being a small part of your overall serverless architecture, right? They're the glue that contains your business logic, your custom code, inside a larger web of managed services that handle the bulk of the undifferentiated heavy lifting that you need to do as part of any application. But those managed services are also not the point, right? We're really fortunate to have such a wide range of managed services for all the different components we need, right? We have databases, we have analytics, we have message queues for all sorts of different patterns. We have identity and access management, which is, of all the things I don't want to own, auth is number one. We have machine learning, we have content delivery, we have all these things, right? And when you're using a managed service, you don't have to worry about patching the servers they run on. You don't have to worry about making sure auto-scaling is working correctly. And all of this lowers your operational burden significantly. But that too is not the point, right? It's great to know that you need to apply fewer resources to keep your applications healthy. That frees up those resources to work on more productive things, like delivering more features. And on occasion, you'll hear people refer to serverless as no-ops. That's not true. Pretty much anybody who says that serverless is no-ops has a vested interest in serverless hype. But anyone who's practicing serverless will tell you, while it's significantly less operational burden than with traditional architectures, there's still operations you need to do, and there's some new and different tasks, like monitoring your provider, that don't exist in traditional architectures. So this saves you money because you have a lot less work to do there. But of course, your cloud bill is not the point. Now sometimes all you're being asked to do is reduce cost, and serverless will usually help you there. But in general, even if you're being asked to reduce cost, your cloud bill is not the entirety of the cost to your organization to go into cloud, right? There's the salaries for the people who are doing operations, right? If they could be applied towards development instead, those people, then all of a sudden the amount of spend on cloud is going down. Now there's CapEx versus OpEx in there, but the point is you want to look holistically at how much you're spending on the cloud. What you're selling is literally technology. But even if the product is a technology, the value may not be that, right? There's an old adage that people don't buy drills, they buy holes, right? They have a problem, they need a hole in their wall, and the drill is just a means to an end. And at iRobot, we don't sell robots. We don't even sell vacuums, right? We sell clean homes. Roomba gives you time back in your day to do the things that matter to you. And it took me several years of working on both Roomba and serverless to realize that that's the same value proposition as serverless. Right? Serverless gives your organization time and money back to focus on the things that really matter, which are your differentiators. So if technology isn't the point, what are we here for? The point is focus. Serverless is a way to focus on customer value. How do functions help you deliver value? They let you focus on your business logic rather than technology that underlies delivery of business logic. Right? Managed services let you focus on writing functions. Having a lower operational burden frees up those resources to instead focus on delivering new features. Things like observability that let you measure mean time between failure and mean time to recovery or resolution those are measures of how often your customers are not getting value. Spending less means that money can go, again, more directly towards creating new value. And focus is the why of serverless. Right? You should be here because you want to focus on creating value. And at your company, you're charged with applying technology to the creation of business value. And so what I'm saying is that serverless has never been about the technology that we call serverless. So what does that technology have to do with it? So it's a consequence of how you're trying to deliver value. Right? Dev and ops teams have been traditionally separated with the notion that they had different focuses. And we're seeing that model changing, right? With DevOps, with you build it, you run it paradigms. And the traditional model put the focus on technology, right? Dev technology and operations tech were different things, so they should be on different teams. What we're seeing now is a focus on the value that they're delivering, feature teams that both build and operate the things that they're doing. So when we take this notion of a focus on customer value, and we take technology that enables us to focus on that, and we run it to its logical conclusion, that's the technology that we call serverless. So when you want to focus on delivering value, you want to write functions. When your function needs to store state somewhere, you're choosing database as a service. And you're choosing between those options based on how well they let you focus. Right? And some of those services that you're using may even be customer facing, right? Social login is a way to rely on a third party so that you don't have to own accounts. Now, if any of these components are down, that's an outage for your customers, and you need to own that. Right? That it's still your problem, even if you can't fix it. And that feeling of being out of control, that you have an outage, you can't fix it for your customers are mad, is a deeply uncomfortable place to be, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And I'll get in a little bit to why that is later. You need to know what bad looks like so that you can ensure that you're delivering quality to your customers. And so serverless is a trait. It's a trait of companies. So if a company decides that it's not going to build things that aren't directly related to its core differentiators, that company is serverless. And very, very few companies are truly serverless across the board. That doesn't mean that parts of it can't be serverless, right? If a team decides that they're going to only build the things that are core to the value that they're delivering, either to customers or elsewhere in the organization, everything that's not core to that, they're going to rely on either another team to deliver or an external, like a third party. That team is going serverless. And you can't always choose to rely on a third party, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't be serverless, because it's about how you're making your choices, not what the options are, right? So if you're big enough, it can even cease to matter, right? Amazon.com uses Lambda, and that's serverless, even though in some sense it's on-prem, right? It's all the same company. But so what if it's just you, right? You're here because you're excited about serverless, but it's only you, and you're on a team that's patching servers for a team that serves a team that's creating user-facing content. So you're far removed from that customer value that I'm talking about. What I want to convince you of is that you can go serverless today in any situation by making the right choices. And this is the point at which my talk sort of turns into a motivational speech. Because serverless is a direction, not a destination. It's about how you choose, not what your choices are. And I've started to think of serverless as a ladder. I wrote a while ago that serverless is a spectrum because there's no clear dividing line between a technology that we call serverless and a technology that we say is not serverless, which is true of almost all categories, that the line is blurry. But with a ladder, you're climbing to some nirvana, right? And it's where you get to deliver pure business value with no overhead. But every rung on the ladder is a valid step in the serverless process, in the serverless journey. If you move from on-prem to a public cloud, that's a rung on the ladder. If you move from VMs to containers, that's a rung on the ladder. If you move from no container orchestration or custom orchestration to Kubernetes, that's a rung on the ladder. but there's always a rung above you, and you should always keep climbing. Right? One thing that the ladder doesn't convey is that it's not linear. Right? So if you're on-prem in VMs, and you're facing the choice between, well, we could move these VMs to EC2, or we could stay on-prem and move them to containers. There's no better in that sense that applies to every situation like that. So I thought about, you could think many paths leading up a mountain, but there's no mountaintop. There's no end to this process. Right? I'm a heavy user of AWS Lambda, but I'm always looking for ways that I can more effectively deliver code and create value with less code that let me keep climbing. So serverless is a state of mind, and you're going to hear about that more today from Farah, which I'm excited about. Again, about how you make decisions, not what your choices are. Every decision is made with constraints, right? But if you know the direction that you want to go in, then you can choose between the options inside those constraints that best aligns with that direction. And then when you're making that, you're moving up, at least one rung. Even if you had no constraints, you could move up a few. So how do you adopt this mindset? How do you make serverless choices? So to start, as Ryan Holiday says, ego is the enemy. A big part of truly embracing the serverless mindset is a change in how we operate as engineers. If we've constructed our identity around the tools and technologies that we use, this is going to be a difficult process. And it also involves, to a large degree, this acceptance of a lack of control over everything that you're working with. And both of these require us to be humble, because we're not at the center of the universe, right? As developers and operators, we've been heads down for a long time because technology is hard. But as the technology gets easier to deliver, as we have more of these managed services, we need to look up and stop taking the rest of the organization for granted. Because what are we trying to do here? We have a product feature hypothesis that we want to get in front of customers so that we can test it, we can find out if we're correct or not, we can adjust our hypothesis and loop back again. That's what's important. Development stands in the way of that process, right? Sure, it's necessary, but it's not inherent to what the value is in that process. And development itself is bigger than developers. There are more stakeholders in that ongoing process. In addition to operations and QA, there are designers, there's UX, right? There's product owners. And as developers, we think about this loop and we think, oh, we're at the center of it. But we're not. Because technology has been hard for a long time, and it's taken clever people to create value through technology. So we've started to believe that that cleverness was inherent and good. Like we've spent so long constructing Swiss watches that we've failed to recognize the advent of like the quartz Casio, and we impugn it as lacking in elegance, not understanding that a quartz watch, right, a $10 watch from a supermarket tells time better than a mechanical Rolex. And so what we want is not that cleverness is not useful anymore. We just want to apply it to business problems instead. Right? And when you have to code, you're solving technology problems, not business problems. In the watch analogy, we have to recognize that our skills for gears and springs are less useful. They inform us, they build our experience, but it's not the right tools for today. We have to start learning electrical engineering. And as I said earlier, this is hardest when we've constructed our identities around the technologies that we use, rather than viewing them as tools to accomplish something else, and that we're experienced tool users that can use any kind of tool. So I like to think of developers as that we deliver technology-enabled value rather than delivering technology itself. This is important because you're not the tool, right? Any tool or technology that you're using is an enabler for you. It's not part of you, right? And it's time now that a lot of technology has been about building and using the tool. And we want to split that now. We want to say that the people who build the tool are delivering that tool to someone else to use it, so that what they're delivering is the value of that tool. And then the user of that tool can more effectively understand the concerns that are upstream of that they need to use the tool for. So for example, build tooling, right? What we want now is that the people who have traditionally delivered the builds, we now want them to deliver the ability for teams to deliver their own builds. And that's all because tool selection should be driven by people, should not be driven by people, it should be driven by value. So you say, serverless sounds great, and you jump in to create a web app. And the first thing you run into is, you're doing this on AWS, how do I handle web requests in Lambda? And you know Express. So you find a framework and it says, oh, you can just do Express in Lambda. So you do that, and you set up API Gateway in front of it as a pass-through. And you're using DynamoDB, great. And you're like, okay, well, I can make API calls in my function to contact the database. And then you're like, okay, well, I've got my proof of concept here. How do I set this up as infrastructure as code? And you find a framework that lets you, just write all of your infrastructure and your function code all in one file, and you're great. Everything's fabulous. So I would argue that you have so much more code in there than you need. And code is a liability, it's not an asset. Code can at best do exactly what you intend it to do. And how often does that actually happen? Right? Your implementations can only ever be imperfect, and you're only losing points through coding. The more code you own, the more opportunities you have from departing from your intended value. So first, API Gateway can handle a lot of web processing for free. Right? With API Gateway, you pay per request, and then all of the features that you use in API Gateway are priced the same, right? So you can do model validation in API Gateway. And when you do model validation, an invalid, a malformed request doesn't even hit your Lambda. So it saves you money. You can also do routing there, and that removes routing logic from your Lambda. That has operational benefits. There's sort of an ongoing discussion in the serverless community about many functions versus smaller, bigger functions, but that's sort of not what I want to get into. But also, if the only thing you're doing in a function is calling DynamoDB, you can actually do that directly from API Gateway itself. And all of a sudden, you have one less moving part. You have no custom code running on a runtime, right? You have the custom things that you've set up API Gateway to do, but that's much more fully managed than Lambda is. And of course, for those frameworks, right, that you're writing, now all of a sudden you're obscuring how much function code you're writing versus infrastructure. And I'll add a little more to that. But of course, doing all of this requires you to learn new things. To use model validation, you need to learn JSON schema. To do those direct integrations, you need to learn velocity templates. You might have to learn CloudFormation and its YAML syntax to do that. But you know JavaScript. Isn't it better when you can just write code and be done with it? So remember here that technology is not the point, right? So how can we best deliver value in this situation? And the answer may not be what's directly easiest or most fun for us. Just because something is harder for us or takes a little longer doesn't mean it's not more effectively delivering value. Serverless development is not about what makes us the most comfortable. It's about stretching our boundaries to be more effective. And developer experience is a poor proxy for measuring that overall total cost of ownership. There's an idolatry of coding today. Like, we've been told that software is eating the world, and we've inaccurately translated that as coding is eating the world. We've come to believe that developers are the only important people in an organization, and that our sense of productivity is the only thing that matters. Right? We've seen this before when dev is separated from ops. The things that are easy to build and the things that are easy to operate are not the same. And so for a developer who's building something, they're going to focus on, well, how can I get this out the door and thrown over that wall to ops as easily as possible? For the organization, now all of a sudden there's all this maintenance burden that's overall slowing down the effectiveness of the organization. And even worse, well, not even worse, less worse is that the developer themselves are less effective because of the potential for ongoing maintenance impositions on their time that are slowing them down from developing the next thing. But that feedback loop is long enough that developers don't often realize that something that they're doing has sort of those long-term effects. So we can change that with you build it, you run it. But I don't think we can incentivize developers directly for everything that makes them more effective. They have to participate and figure out what things are going to make them more effective to the business. And what feels in the moment most productive is usually a poor measure of that optimality. And so flow or deep work or being in the zone, whatever you want to call it, is a great feeling, right? Everyone loves that sense of productivity, but it's a means to an end, not an end in itself, right? Flow is useful, maybe even required to create complexity. And as I said before, complexity has been required for a long time. And coding is really, really good at hitting that flow button in us, right? Those times where you're just gone for hours and you don't even realize it. But flow is not the point. So say you're going home from work and you look at the traffic and it's stop and go on the highway, or you could take the side streets and the traffic there is free flowing, but it's actually going to take you a little longer than if you sat in that traffic in the highway. So how many people here would take the highway and sit in the traffic? Okay. How many people here would take the side streets? Yeah. So I performed the gold standard for scientific research, which is a Twitter poll. And I found that 75% of people said that they'd take the side streets. And I'm a side streets person myself. But let me change this question. Say you're a delivery driver and you're getting paid per delivery. How many people now are going to go take the highway? Right? You're going to make more money. And so it's worth it for you to sit in that traffic. And so as developers, we need to prioritize the actual delivery of value in the big picture over our narrow sense of productivity or enjoyment. Because it may not be actually productive when you zoom out. And so introspection is key here because it helps you zoom out. Right? Take time to step back and evaluate your methods. Are you being inflexible? What attachments, biases, and beliefs do you have that are driving your technology choices, your development process choices, that aren't necessarily effective for the overall organization, for the other people that you're collaborating with? And this serverless is about minimalism, letting go, removing distractions, owning less technology. Marie Kondo is big now, and the same advice applies, right? Find the components of your stack that don't spark joy. But it's the don't spark joy for your organization, right? And part of this is that constraints are good. Now, obviously not all constraints, but constraints remove options, and that can help you focus. In general, the ability to do anything comes at the cost of it taking more energy and focus to do one thing in particular, because there's so many other things to think about. So I think of this as like guardrails may chafe, but you can be faster than if you're always having to watch the edge. I don't know if 10-pin bowling is big here, but like I think about this like bumpers. You raise the bumpers when you're bowling, and you may not feel that you're as good of a bowler, but you're going to knock more pins down, which is the whole point. And I came across this photo that I like. Be afraid of the enormity of the possible, because possibilities carry with them hidden complexity. Right? For any technology, one of the primary evaluation metrics that I use is how much capability it has beyond the task that I'm using it for. Because when there's a lot of extra space, there's a lot of stuff I have to learn about and understand so that I know that I'm going to use it correctly. So for a given task, sorry, let me back up. So like Kubernetes it's touted as a single tool that can accomplish any cloud need. And that's true, but for any given task, you're going to have to worry about Kubernetes acting in ways. You've accounted for everything for your task, but Kubernetes can be acting in ways that are relevant to other tasks that screw up what you're trying to do. Right? On the other hand, when you're looking at serverless services, you may be choosing between an 80% solution on your main cloud provider and another provider that has sort of the 100%, exactly what you need. And there's proponents of multi-cloud, which means different things, but in this case means finding the ideal provider for every given task and using them so that you're using all of these services to their greatest extent. But there are hidden complexities in there. You're pulling in this new provider. What does its operations look like? What does its auth look like? How does this integrate into the rest of your system and increase your overall operational burden? Now that could be worth it, given the features that you're going to gain, but it's something that you need to weigh in sort of the bigger picture, and it's a lot of stuff that you don't know. Known unknowns, right? That you say, well, until we start using it, we're not going to find out. And the best flywheels are not the lightest ones, right? They're not the heaviest for sure, but spinning up a flywheel takes effort. And if you have to learn something new, something more, remember that just because it takes longer to start doesn't mean it's not going to make you more effective in the long run. Like the hello world for any technology is almost never indicative of its effectiveness in the long run. So in serverless, we have a lot of infrastructure, and that's good. Because that means we're relying on managed services for as much as we possibly can. Instead of our application being defined by the execution graph in our code, it's defined by our infrastructure graph and the little bits of custom code bringing in our business logic that tie it together. And of course, fewer places that you have custom code, again, is better for you, right? It's fewer opportunities to screw things up. So then we get to the question of defining that infrastructure graph, which I touched on earlier. And too often we reach for coding, right? At worst, writing code that goes into a local tool that's responsible for setting up the cloud infrastructure. Instead, what you want is to use that same serverless approach. How can I use a managed service to do my deployment for me? On AWS, this is CloudFormation. And how can we use tools that are more narrowly scoped to the task that I'm trying to accomplish, which is deployment and defining of infrastructure graphs, so that there's fewer possibilities to remove. So infrastructure as code is good, but I think people often get a little confused or misled by what code means. Because YAML is code, right? CloudFormation gives you a domain-specific language with a YAML or JSON syntax that's non-Turing complete and it's declarative. You get a document, right? It's still infrastructure as code. Infrastructure as code is where you have files, essentially, that define your infrastructure that you can check into source control, and automated mechanisms that read those files and do the deployment. So it's the nature of code that's different here. And I think one of the problems going back to developers thinking the center of things is looking down on YAML configuration file formats as not real programming. And I think that's a really, I think it's a problematic attitude. It feeds into long-standing problems in our industry around developers demeaning the other folks in the product delivery process when they have a lot of value to provide that developers often don't see and need to recognize to make themselves more effective. But I also think another problem that we have here is that these more specific languages don't tend to have the great tools that we have for our familiar languages in our IDEs. But I think the solution there is to demand better tools for these more narrowly scoped things than to retreat back into the places we have good tools right now. And the reason for this is that understanding your deployed infrastructure is critical in the long run. It's really important that you understand what's deployed so that you can debug it, so that you know how to maintain it, how to operate it, to respond to incidents in it. And if your interface is too far removed from that, if it hides too much of that complexity, there are things that can go wrong that you're going to have a hard time fixing. So you want the tools that you're using to teach you about how your deployed infrastructure is working. I like this as the serverless mindset, right? How do you evaluate a technology? It's annoying. It's a new thing to learn. Using it may not hit that flow feeling in the same way, but it saves you time. And when we do this, we can we can get better experiences, but only if we're open to these revolutions from existing models. I think to pick on one provider, Google Cloud has sort of gone all in on containers and Kubernetes. And one of the consequences of that is like Google Cloud Functions take zip files. But if you want anything a little more complicated than that, you have to go into containers. And that's always going to be the answer there, I think, because it fits with the rest of the strategy. Whereas on Lambda, they thought for a long time, and they came up with this concept of layers. And layers allows you to still have a managed OS always, and have a managed or custom runtime, and then other pieces of code that come from independently managed sources, and then your custom logic on top, right? Your main function code. And that allows all of these pieces to be updated independently without requiring sort of a top to bottom rebuild that a container would require. And I don't know that that's the ideal model, that the way that Lambda has done it, but by breaking from the existing packaging model, which is everything top to bottom is in one image, we're able to get a more managed experience there. And I think that's powerful. And we should be thinking about ways in which breaking from the past allows us to do those things. And of course, when you're using managed services, outages can be stressful. And it's always going to feel awful. You're always going to feel like, well, if I was running something for this, I would be able to fix it. But the truth is that you would be worse at running it because it's their job to be good at it, and it's your job to be good at something else. Right? It's a distraction from your primary purpose. So I think that's a brilliant set of guidelines for choosing technology from Jared Short of Trek 10. So if there's something inside the ecosystem that you can just reach for, do that. So many possibilities go away when you're staying with what you know for that. But if you can't get it there, or you need more, it's not quite fulfilling enough, then go buy it somewhere else. But if you can't buy it, before you build it, can you rethink what you're trying to do to adjust it so that you can buy something for it? And this is really important, because again, that time to market, right? You have a hypothesis, you have something you think is valuable, and you're going to try and deliver that, but you don't know that it's right until it's out there. So you're better off taking something off the shelf and building something that's close to that, but faster to find out, than to take extra time to build that thing exactly. And what this turns into is, Agile says that requirements can change at any time, but that requirements change can be a dialogue with product management, not unidirectional. And so I like this diagram. And it's good, right? But can you make a tweak to your requirements to get technology that's more managed? And finally, if you have to build it, own it, right? If no one sells it, well, it could be a differentiator for you. But just because you've already built something doesn't mean you should try and turn it into a differentiator, right? Consider the things that are only what you couldn't get if you were a greenfield. So fundamentally, you want to find your part of the business value. What does your technology work in service of? And maybe you're far removed from that customer value, right? You may be only contributing a small slice of value to the end product. But it's there, and you can find it, and you can focus on it. Right? Start with the immediate value you're providing to other people in the organization, and then start to work your way up the value chain from there. And make sure your decisions are all oriented around that value. Make serverless choices. Remember that you're not the tool, right? For any value that you're creating, automate that creation. It's going to give you time to create more value. If you manage build servers, make them self-service, right? I like this quote, but you can also turn it around. Automate yourself out of a job, and then keep demanding new jobs. So to sum up, serverless is about focus, and technology is not the point. The nature of development is changing, and that requires us to be humble and to understand how the product delivery process works in a holistic manner. Find your own part of the business value, and make serverless choices. Thank you.